Hi everyone, in this chapter we're going to be going through time-lapse compositions. One of the most important things when it comes to setting up your time-lapse is how to compose the shot. I'm going to be going through some of my favorite setups. I'll be showing you how I conceived them, how they were executed, and ultimately what the end result was. Hopefully along the way you'll see something that you like, you can pick up from it, and then ultimately hopefully inspire you to go out there and find beautiful compositions of your own. So let's dive in. The first composition we're going to look at is a stationary shot, but it's a stationary shot that's fixated to a moving vehicle. In this case, it's a New York City cab. The shot was conceived because the client wanted to see from the perspective of a New York City cab driver as they went through their day. I think the most difficult aspect of the shot was actually finding a cab driver that was willing to allow us to attach a rig to his car, and then the second was figuring out what the shutter speed and the interval worked best to execute the shot. We mounted a rig to the cab using a 3-point suction cup mount, and then tied multiple safety ropes to it just in case something happened, which it didn't. And when we started shooting, I decided to use a 1-second shutter speed with a 2-second interval, but as it started going, I found that it just didn't look right, especially because whenever the cab hit a bump or there wasn't levelness in the road, it really showed in the shot. The blur that was created just didn't look that appealing. So then I opted for a 0.5-second shutter speed with a 1-second interval, and that turned out to be the sweet spot to really get the shot the way that I wanted. We mounted the camera on both the roof and the side of the car, and we did this over the course of about 3 or 4 hours maybe. We ended up paying the cab driver, I think, 3 or 4 times what the actual fare amount was, and he was really happy with that. The end result is a 2-shot sequence that's been used in TV programs and also been turned into a viral GIF. It's definitely one of my favorite top 3 time-lapse compositions. The next series of compositions that I really enjoyed take place in Shanghai, China. The first was a super interesting shot of something that I had really never tried before. I never really thought about trying. The client wanted a shot from the perspective of a motorbike's mirror, but we didn't have a motorbike to use, and we wanted to do something that was practical. So instead of purchasing a motorbike, we actually went out and got a mirror from a shop, mounted it to our motion control rig, set the focus to the mirror, and came up with this really unique shot, something that I've never done before. The hardest part was really just finding a two-way composition that looked good both in the mirror and from behind the mirror. We ended up finding this really narrow alleyway that showed both the Shanghai TV tower, which is very iconic, but was also busy with tourists, so we were able to film a bunch of different elements all in the same shot. It was also about 110 degrees out when we were shooting, so we were all melting, even though it was like midnight when we were shooting this. After the shot, we headed to an area in Shanghai called the Bund, where we were granted access to the top of a building right near the bank of the river. It really gave us this beautiful, spectacular view of the city, and below us we were able to see all of the commotion happening, whether it was with the people or the cars. It was just honestly complete chaos. I was using a 5-axis time-lapse rig at the time, and I was able to really show a unique movement using perspective motion, utilizing both the foreground and the background in a way that was both a reveal and an establishing shot. I absolutely love the movement of the people and the cars below, coupled with that of the city and the riverfront activity happening in the secondary background. When you're able to merge these types of elements together, you'll find that the end results are just simply magical. Both of these shots were filmed using the Sony a7R III with Tokina Vista 8K Prime lenses, and I used those because I really just wanted to give it a little bit of character. Since it was dark outside, I was able to open up to about a T1.8 and retain all the shutter speed, information, and ISO that we needed to create that motion blur. Finding new perspectives to shoot from or angles that you don't normally see is what really sells the final shot. When you're able to do something that's both interesting and tells a story, the imagery becomes so much more powerful as a tool or a vehicle to progress to production. I also absolutely love the coloring in this scene, just because everything seems so vibrant, it seems so alive, it's so awake, and being able to capture that in time-lapse is just something that I think is super mesmerizing to watch, but it's also very fun and lighthearted. My next favorite composition uses reflection again, and it's coupled with a giant 60-floor skyscraper and busy New York City streets. This is likely my number one shot that I've ever taken, just because the way that it came about, finding it was quite interesting and unique. I really never intended to shoot this actual shot, because instead the client wanted just rooftop shots of other rooftops from a rooftop, and I was going to use that gap in the building as, just showing some depth with the slider. But what happened though is, as I was setting up, I decided to look down, and when I saw all the reflections in the glass coupled with the traffic below, I literally immediately decided to change up the shot. I had tested it during the daytime with a 0.5-second shutter speed and a 1-second interval, but as I noticed that the cars in the shot just weren't producing enough motion trails, so when it came time to actually film it at night, I ended up going with a 2-second shutter speed and a 3-second interval. For me, the way the light is reflected in the glass, the motion of the people in the cars with the light streaking by really struck a chord with me. The setup itself was super simple. It was just a 6-foot slider using a single-axis motion control with the camera tilted down at a perfect 90-degree angle. I used a 14mm lens to film this so that it would show as much perspective movement as possible, which then amplifies the final shot because you're getting all of that beautiful foreground movement. This is another case where if you're not looking in all directions, up, down, left, right, you may actually miss a really beautiful shot. And in this case, it was a happy accident that I actually looked down and I saw the mirrors and I saw how the reflections were working in the shot. And I really thought to myself, wow, this could be an incredible time-lapse shot. And it turned out to be an incredible time-lapse shot. Sticking around New York, another shot that I got incredibly lucky with was taken from the rooftop of the Tudor City building. We happened to be filming the day that Manhattanhenge occurred, so we had front row seats being on 42nd Street, where we could see the sun perfectly dip between the buildings. For the setup, I again used a simple one-axis motion-controlled move from day into night, and I was really just blown away by how lucky we were with the cloud coverage as well as the lighting conditions. I had scouted the shot the day before, but really never anticipated getting the sun to look so beautiful as it set between the buildings. I was also able to shoot a secondary 200mm stationary shot that blended really well with the master shot as a cut-in. One of the things I look for when I'm performing these types of simple motion control moves are foreground objects that are, one, going to be helpful in telling the story of the location that we're shooting, and two, that they lend themselves to the composition from start to finish. Since I was using a 6-foot slider, I was able to extend past the edge of the building a little bit and really make it seem as if the camera was floating off into space on its own. It's a simple but really effective technique to add depth to your frame when you're using a motion control slider. For this shot, I used a 16mm lens, manually ramped from day into night, changing the exposure every one stop of lost light, which is really painstaking, and this technique really isn't used anymore because with the advancement of mirrorless cameras, you really don't have to do that. But again, the final result is something that is truly interesting to watch, and I really enjoyed shooting this. In this next shot, the client wanted to shoot a day-to-night sequence of the St. Patrick's Cathedral in New York City from a hotel room that they had rented out for a 3-day time period. During our test phase, we had shot some dummy time-lapse, and the biggest issue we found was that there were reflections from the glass as the sun was hitting and refracting off of other buildings. It really created this ugly and awful ghosting that essentially kind of killed the shot. Even though we blacked out the entire room and the camera lens itself, we ended up getting permission from the building's owner to physically remove the glass from the window and shoot it that way, because if we hadn't done that, post-production would have been near impossible, but sometimes it's what you have to do to get the shot. The final frame, which is about 20 hours in total shoot time, was condensed down in just a few seconds worth of the shot, and that was what was used in the final promo for the client. This was kind of a simple but difficult shoot at the same time. I also manually stopped down the camera during this time period because there was some issues with the exposure just because of all the reflection and refraction that was happening with the glass. Heading into the Swiss Alps, this next shot is an incredibly simple execution, but I just love how the stars and the light from the moon really help create depth and mood in the frame. This was taken in Zermatt, Switzerland in April during a full moon, and the temps were around -10 degrees Fahrenheit, which was probably the biggest hurdle in setting up this shot. I had to use a combination of lens warmers and hands warmers for the body and the lens and the motion control rig because the power was draining so quickly due to the cold. The shot took around 8 hours to film, and there was actually around 200 frames at the end that didn't get captured because all of the equipment died during the shoot. This goes back to why it's important to prepare for your shoot and to make sure you have contingencies in place if things go wrong. The bright side of the story is that the client loved the first 15 seconds of the shot, and it's exactly what they were looking for. So even though we lost power at the very end of the sequence, we were able to get the shot that the client ultimately wanted. For this setup, I used a simple 3-foot slider with a 2-axis head and basically tracked the stars as they moved from around 6 p.m. at night to around 4 or 5 a.m. I used a 14mm cinema lens and then let the camera's exposure drop as the moon disappeared and the sun rose. I chose this particular composition because I wanted to include some of the mountaintops in the shot to give the viewer a sense of perspective and location, but the ultimate goal was just to track the stars as they moved across the night sky. The negative space in the frame where the stars are was actually used for 3D motion text in the final composition. This last composition may be my most iconic setup, as it was the frame used to create the main title graphic for Netflix's House of Cards. The composition of the shot came about because the production wanted a scene that depicted the U.S. Capitol in a dark, gritty light, so I ended up having to wait 3 or 4 weeks for the perfect weather to happen to snag this shot. Since everything related to the clouds and the feel of those clouds, I attempted this shot multiple times, and this was ultimately the winner. The definition in the clouds and the reflection in the water really made this truly a moody shot. It was shot using a 24mm lens with a simple tripod, which kind of goes to show you don't really need a fancy rig to create something that may live on in history forever. For the shot, I used a variety of ND filters to blur the water, as well to try to blur out the people, but ultimately those people were all removed in post-production because that's what the director wanted. This shot was later replaced in season 2 with a similar shot, but it was taken in the wintertime instead of the summer. Originally for this shot, I wanted to frame the camera up so Grant's Memorial was directly in the center of the frame, but I quickly decided to adjust the monument to the right because I felt it gave the scene more depth and made for a better composition. This way you can see the U.S. Capitol in all its glory as well as the monument, so it's kind of like the best of both worlds. Now that you've seen a variety of compositions that can be created with time-lapse, it's time you get creative to see what you can make. That'll do it for this chapter. I'll see you in the next.